everyone. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know the drill, right? We take these kind of big, often pretty complex topics, and we try to break them down, give you the real core of what's going on without getting bogged down in all the, super nitty-gritty details. Today we're diving into the leadership of Xi Jinping in China.
And it's a fascinating one. Really get to the heart of how power works, how it's wielded, how it's perceived. We've got this, honestly, really in-depth analysis we're working from.
Yeah, it's not just like a surface level thing. This piece really digs into Xi's time leading China, the policies he's put in place. We're even looking at the whole structure of the Chinese political system.
And the real question we're grappling with, straight from this analysis, does the label dictator actually fit Xi Jinping? Is that a fair assessment?
So that's what we're going to unpack today. You're with us on this deep dive. We're aiming to come away with a real grasp of what's at stake in this debate, some genuine insights, and hey, maybe even a few things along the way that make you stop and think, never thought of it that way. No info overload, though, we promise.
That's the deep dive guarantee.
Exactly. All right, let's get into it. So first things first, when we throw around this word dictator, what are we actually talking about? What are the hallmarks, the essential ingredients?
Well, typically when we talk about a dictator, we're talking about power. A lot of it. And more importantly, power that is largely concentrated in the hands of a single person.
Right, one individual calling the shots.
Yeah. And often you'll see that there isn't a lot of genuine political competition. Like you might have different parties, different viewpoints in name, but the reality is there's only limited space for them to operate.
Not a level playing field, basically.
Exactly. And then there's this other really crucial piece, checks and balances, or more accurately, the lack of them. In a dictatorship, there aren't many, if any, strong institutions to kind of limit or restrain the power of that central figure.
Okay, so you've got this concentrated power, limited political competition, and a real shortage of those checks and balances. What else?
Well, and this is maybe the most defining feature, the suppression of opposition. Any serious challenge to the leader's authority, any significant dissent that tends to be met with, well, let's just say it doesn't go over so well.
Right, shut down pretty quickly. Okay, so we've got our kind of dictator checklist. Now let's hold that up to Xi Jinping's leadership. Based on what we've been reading, where do we see some potential overlap? What pops out?
Okay, so one of the things that really jumps out from this analysis, and frankly it sent shockwaves around the world when it happened, was the abolition of presidential term limits back in 2018. This move, essentially, it allows Xi Jinping to stay in power indefinitely.
Yeah, that was a huge moment. I remember following that really closely. It felt like a real turning point. And this whole idea of indefinite rule, that's something we pretty strongly associate with, more authoritarian systems.
Absolutely. And the analysis goes on to highlight how Xi has been really effectively consolidating his power. And one of the main ways he's done this is through these central leading groups and commissions. These bodies, they operate both within the Communist Party, which is obviously the dominant political force in China, and within the state structure as a whole. And here's the key. They all report directly to Xi Jinping.
So even if there are other bodies, other institutions in theory, these groups are kind of like his direct line, bypassing the traditional channels?
You could see it that way, yeah. And what this has done, it's certainly streamlined decision-making. Things can move quickly. But, and this is what the analysis picks up on, it's really diminished the role of those more traditional collective leadership bodies, like the Politburo.
Okay, so for folks who aren't super familiar with the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party, the Politburo, remind us what that is again?
Sure, the Politburo, it's essentially the top decision-making body within the CPC. It's where major policies are debated, where directions are set. But the point the analysis is making is that even though the Politburo still exists, the dynamics have shifted. Xi Jinping's influence through those leading groups has really become dominant.
So the Politburo, it's there, but the power balance has tipped pretty heavily towards Xi. Our analysis also talks about this tightening grip on various aspects of Chinese society, right?
Right. Control has definitely been dialed up under Xi. The analysis goes into detail about how civil society, the media, particularly news outlets, online platforms, all of that's under much tighter control. And one of the key elements of this has been the suppression of dissenting voices.
Dissent meaning anyone speaking out against the government, against Xi Jinping's policies.
Yeah, broadly speaking, we're talking activists, human rights lawyers, even academics who are expressing, views that are critical of the direction things are going. And the analysis points out that there's been a real curtailment of those core freedoms of expression, freedom of assembly, those things we often take for granted in more democratic societies.
So if you're in China and you want to publicly criticize the government, or Xi Jinping specifically, you're likely to run into some serious problems.
It's not something that's tolerated very well now.
Okay, and then there's the big one that's gotten a lot of international attention, the anti-corruption campaign. I remember when this really kicked off, it was presented as this huge cleanup effort within the Communist Party.
Right. And to be fair, the analysis does acknowledge that corruption was a very real problem within the CPC. And a lot of officials who were engaged in, bribery, abuse of power, they were removed. But here's where the analysis gets really interesting. It suggests that this campaign, while tackling a legitimate issue, also served another purpose.
Like a two birds with one stone kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. The analysis argues that Xi Jinping very skillfully does this campaign to sideline his political rivals, to consolidate his power base within the party. So you had this visible effort to clean up corruption, which was generally popular, and at the same time, it was strengthening Xi's position at the top.
Clever. So it's like on the surface, it's about good governance, but underneath, there's this whole other power play going on. Okay, so we've laid out some pretty strong arguments that do seem to align with, this traditional idea of a dictator. But our source, as you said, it doesn't just stop there and goes on to present a different perspective. So what are the main points against just slapping on that dictator label?
Right. So one of the key counterarguments that comes up is about the very nature of China's political system. Even with all this concentration of power in Xi's hands that we've been discussing, the argument is that China still, at least on paper, functions within this framework of the Communist Party's collective leadership. So decisions are still supposed to be, and to some extent are, deliberated within the Politburo, especially its standing committee.
Oh, right, the standing committee that's like the inner circle of the Politburo, right? Even more exclusive, even more powerful.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Politburo's Politburo. And the point here is that this suggests a more, I guess you could say, structured form of governance than just your unadulterated individual dictatorship.
So she is operating within the system, even if he's become the dominant figure within it. It's a nuanced point. The other argument against the dictator label, if I'm remembering correctly, has to do with China's economic performance.
Right. A lot of people point to the undeniable economic success that China has achieved under Xi Jinping's leadership. The scale of poverty reduction in the country has been truly remarkable. And that economic progress, that tangible improvement in the lives of millions, that's seen by many as a kind of validation, a justification for the current way China is governed. Their argument is that, well, if it's working, if people's lives are getting better, does it really matter if there's this concentration of political power at the top?
It's like, okay, maybe individual rights and political freedoms are being curtailed, but if people are lifted out of poverty, if their lives are materially improving, maybe they're more willing to accept that trade-off.
That's the argument, yeah. And it raises this whole question of how different societies define legitimate leadership, what they prioritize. It's fascinating.
It really is. Okay, so we've got these competing arguments around the dictator label. To really understand how Xi's leadership functions, the analysis digs into specific policies and initiatives. It's like, okay, it's one thing to hold power, but what are you actually doing with it?
Yeah, let's get concrete.
Exactly. So let's start with the economic stuff. There was this phrase, supply-side structural reform, that popped up. What's that all about?
So essentially what the analysis is saying is this represents a shift in China's economic strategy. For a long time, the focus was really on just pure economic growth, expanding as fast as possible. This reform, it's about recognizing that, maybe that's not sustainable in the long run. It's about moving towards a model that prioritizes the quality of that growth. Tackling things like overcapacity in certain industries, really promoting innovation, aiming for a more balanced and hopefully more sustainable kind of economic development.
So it's like moving from quantity to quality, a more, I guess, mature approach to their economic growth.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
And then there's the big one, the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, the scale of this thing is just mind-blowing. This massive global network of infrastructure projects.
Right, and it's spanning multiple continents. The analysis lays out how it's all about enhancing trade, connectivity on a global level, but it also very clearly points to how this is a way for China to expand its economic and geopolitical influence.
It's like China's putting its stamp on the world map, literally. Roads, railways, ports all over Asia, Africa, parts of Europe.
Yeah, and this goes hand in hand with a really big domestic push on the technology front.
Right. This was another thing that stood out in the analysis, this huge emphasis on tech, innovation.
The analysis talks about how China has been pouring resources into key areas. Artificial intelligence, big data, biotechnology. It's clear they want to become a global leader in these advanced technologies, moving beyond, just being the world's factory.
So this drive for self-sufficiency, for tech dominance, that's a major theme of Xi Jinping's leadership. Now, shifting gears a bit, this was one of the parts of the analysis that I found most surprising, China's environmental policies under Xi.
Interesting, right? You might not expect a highly centralized system like China's to be so, well, seemingly proactive on the environmental front. But the analysis does highlight these very ambitious goals that China has set.
Right? Like this whole pledge to reach peak carbon emissions before 2030 and then, get this, carbon neutrality by 2060. That's a massive undertaking, especially for a country that's still developing, still industrializing. How are they going to pull that off?
Well, the analysis points to the fact that China is already, by far, the world's biggest investor in renewable energy, especially solar and wind. And, this centralized control that we've been talking about, it actually plays a role here. It allows them to direct resources to implement these green initiatives on a massive scale, much more quickly than many other countries could.
So it's like this double-edged sword. That same centralization that might raise concerns about political freedom can also be very effective when it comes to pushing these big top-down environmental changes. Fascinating. What about social policies? What's the impact on, everyday people?
Well, the analysis emphasizes this big goal that was set to eradicate extreme poverty in China by 2020. And they put a lot of resources behind this. Targeted programs, government investment, it was a major priority.
And did they actually achieve it? Like, is that claim legitimate?
That's a whole debate in itself. There's been a lot of scrutiny of those poverty figures. But the analysis does present it as a, significant accomplishment, something that had a tangible impact on millions of lives.
Okay, so poverty alleviation is a big one. What other social policies are highlighted?
Healthcare reform is another major area. They've been working to expand health insurance coverage, improve the quality of healthcare services, with the ultimate goal of, achieving universal access for all citizens.
So again, these large-scale efforts aimed at improving people's lives. Okay, now let's zoom out a bit and look at China on the world stage under Xi. The analysis talks about a pretty clear shift in their foreign policy approach.
Yeah, they use the term assertive diplomacy, which I think sums it up pretty well. We've seen China taking a much more active and, at times, more aggressive stance in international relations.
Right, like their claims in the South China Sea. That's been a major source of tension.
Absolutely. And they're also playing a much more prominent role in those big international institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization. They're not shying away from asserting their interests, their vision on a global level.
So it's a departure from that more, I guess, cautious, behind-the-scenes approach that China took for a while. This also ties into this whole idea of reforming global governance that the analysis talks about.
Right. China is pushing for some pretty significant changes in how these global institutions operate, how decisions are made. They want to see more influence from developing countries. And this whole idea of a multipolar world order, as opposed to the U.S.-dominated system, that's a key part of their foreign policy strategy.
So basically, shaking things up, trying to reshape the existing power dynamics in their favor. And then, of course, there's the military side of things. We have to talk about that. China's military modernization has been, well, pretty intense.
Yeah. The analysis goes into some detail about how the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, has undergone these huge reforms. The focus is on improving their combat readiness, getting them prepared for potential conflicts. And there's been a ton of investment in new technologies, advanced weaponry. They're restructuring the PLA to make it more effective, more capable of conducting these complex joint operations across different branches. And all of this is reflected in China's defense budget, which has been steadily increasing.
So it's a comprehensive modernization effort. More troops, better equipment, more sophisticated strategies. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The consolidation of Xi Jinping's political power, the economic reforms, the environmental policies, that assertive diplomacy, the military buildup, it all adds up to a really complex picture, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that's the point the analysis is ultimately making. Whether you label Xi Jinping a dictator, it really comes down to how you interpret this concentration of power, how you weigh it against the specific realities of China's political system, its history, its unique trajectory.
It's this tension that we've been talking about. On the one hand, you have these characteristics that we typically associate with dictators, the centralized control, the limits on dissent, the potential for using campaigns like the anti-corruption one to consolidate power. But on the other hand, you have the argument that, well, this is still happening within the existing structures of the Communist Party. And, crucially, there seems to be genuine public support for Xi and his policies, driven, at least in part, by those economic successes.
Right. And it makes it difficult to just, apply a simple label and be done with it. We have to grapple with the nuances, the contradictions even.
Absolutely. And the fact that China's actions, both domestically and internationally, are having such a huge impact on the world, that just makes this whole conversation even more important, more urgent.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question we're left with is this. How do we make sense of a system that exhibits these seemingly contradictory traits? And maybe even more broadly, how do we define leadership in the 21st century, especially when we're talking about a country like China, a rising global power with such a different political system than what many of us are used to? These are questions worth pondering.
They really are. And with Xi Jinping seemingly set to lead China for the foreseeable future, these questions, they're only going to become more important as we try to understand what China's rise means for all of us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another one. Until then, keep thinking deeply, everyone.